The galaxy had been at peace for 6,000 years. Not the kind of peace that comes from kindness, not the kind that grows from trust or friendship between different peoples. It was the kind of peace that comes from fear, the kind that is held in place by an iron fist so large and so powerful that no one dares to raise their voice, let alone a weapon. The Galactic Concord was that iron fist. It was a union of more than 400 alien species. It stretched across 3 full spiral arms of the Milky Way galaxy. It had warships beyond counting. It had weapons that could crack a moon in half. It had laws written over thousands of years, and it had soldiers, billions of them, sworn to enforce those laws without question or mercy. For 6,000 years, the Galactic Concord had been the highest power in the known galaxy. There had been rebellions, yes. There had been small uprisings on distant worlds. There had been pirates and smugglers and border disputes between member species. But no one, not a single civilization in the recorded history of the Concord, had ever stood against the full might of the Empire and survived to speak of it. The Concord liked it that way. The Senate, which governed all 400 member species, sat on a planet called Vel Prime. It was a beautiful world, all golden plains and deep blue oceans, with a capital city that stretched for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. Towers of pale stone rose into the clouds. Ships moved through the sky like schools of fish in the sea. The streets were filled with beings of every shape and color and size, all of them living under the protection of the most powerful government the galaxy had ever seen. On the outer edges of Concord space, there was a region called the Outer Veil. It was a cold and mostly empty stretch of the galaxy, a place of dead stars and broken asteroid fields and long stretches of dark space where nothing interesting ever happened. The Concord had sensor stations out there, staffed by low-ranking soldiers who spent most of their time doing very little. It was considered a punishment posting. If you did something wrong in the Concord military, they sent you to the Outer Veil. Sensor Station Keth 7 was one of the most boring postings in the entire Outer Veil. It sat on a small rock of a moon orbiting a dead brown dwarf star. There were 12 soldiers stationed there at any given time. They monitored deep space. They filed reports that nobody read. They ate their meals in silence and counted the days until their rotation ended. The soldier on duty the night everything changed was a young Kreth named Soval. The Kreth were a reptilian species, gray-green skin, large golden eyes, long thin fingers built for delicate work. Soval was 23 years old by Concord Standard Time. He had been stationed at Keth 7 for 8 months. He had filed 242 sensor reports in that time, and not a single one had contained anything worth noting. He was eating a cold meal and staring at his sensor screen when the reading appeared. At first, he thought it was a malfunction. The sensor showed an object moving through deep space approximately 60 light hours outside the Outer Veil boundary. That in itself was not unusual. Space was full of objects, comets, asteroids, old dead satellites from species that no longer existed. But what made Soval set down his food and lean forward was not the object itself. It was the speed. The object was moving faster than anything Soval had ever seen on a sensor screen. Not faster in a way that could be explained by a standard hyperdrive. Hyperdrive travel was a technology every species in the Concord used. It folded space around a ship, allowing it to cross vast distances in short amounts of time. But this object was not folding space. There was no hyperspace signature, no fold wave, no the usual trails that a ship in jump travel left behind. This object was simply moving, burning through normal space at a speed that should have been physically impossible. Soval checked the sensor calibration. He ran a diagnostic. He checked it again. The reading was real. He pulled up the energy signature of the object. That was when the cold crept into his chest. The energy coming off that object was enormous. It was not the clean, efficient energy of a conquered vessel running on standard power. It was raw and hot and almost violent in the way it burned. The object was pouring energy into its engines the way a dying star pours light into space, without care, without economy, without any concern for how much it was using. Whatever was out there, it was burning bright and it was coming fast. Sovol filed an alert report. He marked it high priority, the first high-priority report he had filed in 8 months. Then he sat back in his chair and watched the sensor screen and felt the hair on the back of his neck, such as it was, being a Kreth standing up. The report reached Outer Vale Command within the hour. The duty officer at command was a Dominion officer named Subcommander Heth. The Dominion was the most powerful species within the Conquered, large, blue-skinned beings with 4 arms and a long history of military dominance. Heth had been a soldier for 30 years. He had seen a great many things. He looked at Sovol's report and frowned. Then he looked at it again. He pulled up the sensor data directly. He compared it against every known ship classification in the Conquered database. He ran the energy signature against a library of over 2,000 recorded alien propulsion systems. He found nothing that matched. The database returned a single result labeled unknown, anomalous, no match found. Heth sent a message up the chain of command. He did not mark it high priority. He marked it urgent. By the time the message reached Admiral Command at the Outer Vale Regional Headquarters, the object had crossed 2 more light towers. It had not slowed. It had not changed course. It was moving in a straight line, directly toward Conquered space, as if it knew exactly where it was going and had no interest in hiding the fact. Admiral Command dispatched 3 scout cruisers. The scout cruisers were fast, lightly armed ships designed for exactly this kind of situation, an unidentified object in deep space that needed to be identified and, if necessary, turned away. The 3 cruisers moved in formation. Their commanders were experienced officers. They had intercepted unknown signals before. This was routine, or so they told themselves. The lead cruiser, the KCS Varath, reached sensor range of the object first. The commander of the Varath, a veteran Kreth officer named Captain Orlin, looked at his tactical screen and felt something he had not felt in a long time. He felt afraid. The object was a ship. That much was clear now that they were close enough to see it directly on visual sensors, but it was unlike any ship Orlin had ever seen. It was enormous, not in the way that Conquered capital ships were enormous, with clean geometric lines and carefully designed hull sections. This ship looked like it had been built and then rebuilt and then rebuilt again, over and over, across a very long time. The hull was covered in patches and welds and repairs. Great scars ran along its sides, marks of impacts and burns that spoke of battles Orlin couldn't even imagine. Parts of it looked almost ancient. Other parts looked newer, added on as if the ship had grown over centuries. And it was burning. Not on fire, but its engines were pouring out energy at a level that made the Varath sensors scream with overflow warnings. The light coming off the ship's engine ports was the blue-white of something working beyond its designed limits, and yet the ship did not break apart. It held together. It moved forward. It was not slowing down. Orlin hailed the ship on all standard frequencies. He transmitted the Conquered standard challenge code, a signal that every registered vessel in Conquered space was required to respond to. He sent it 7 times, on 7 different bands. No response. He ordered the Varath to move into the ship's path, a standard intercept maneuver, placing his vessel directly ahead of the incoming object to force it to either stop or change course. The Varath's navigator had barely finished the maneuver when the proximity alarm went off. The unknown ship had not slowed, had not turned, had not acknowledged them at all. It was simply continuing on its path. Orlin gave the order to emergency boost out of the way. The Varath's engine screamed. The ship lurched sideways. It was not fast enough. The unknown ship passed within 200 kilometers of the Varath at full speed. The shockwave hit like a physical wall. The Varath was thrown end over end, its systems flaring and dying and rebooting in rapid sequence. Orlan was slammed against his harness so hard his vision went dark for several seconds. When he could see again, his bridge was full of smoke and sparks, and every screen was showing damage readouts in urgent red. The Varath had survived, but barely. It was dead in space, drifting, systems struggling to come back online. The second cruiser, the KCS Drath, reported that it had been flipped completely over by the shockwave and had lost all primary propulsion. It was slowly spinning in the void. The third cruiser did not report at all. Orlan later found out that the KCS Orvan had been directly in the ship's path and had not gotten out of the way in time. The shockwave had hit it dead on. There were no survivors. One cruiser destroyed, 2 heavily damaged, 312 conquered soldiers dead. Not from a weapon, from a shockwave, from the wake of a ship that had not even noticed them. The report that reached Outer Veil Command 20 minutes later was not marked urgent. There was a classification above urgent that had not been used in over 200 years. It was called absolute emergency, and it was reserved for situations that threatened the stability of the Concord itself. Heth used it. The message burned across Concord communication networks at maximum priority. It was flagged and escalated at every relay station it passed through. By the time it reached the capital on Vel Prime, it had been read by 14 different admirals, 6 Concord senators, and the personal staff of the Supreme Commander of the Dominion Fleet. The Concord Senate convened an emergency session within 3 hours. The chamber was a vast circular room at the heart of the capital city. It could seat representatives from all 400 member species. It was rarely full. On the day the alert came through, it was standing room only. Grand Admiral Velkrath stood at the center of the chamber and read out the report. Velkrath was a large being, even by Dominion standards. He had fought in 7 wars. He had commanded fleets of 10,000 ships. He was the kind of soldier who did not easily show fear. His hands were shaking slightly as he read. The chamber erupted when he finished. Voices in 100 different languages rose at once. Species who had not spoken to each other in decades were suddenly shouting across the floor. The noise was so great that the session chair had to trigger the emergency silence system, a low-frequency pulse that suppressed all sound in the room for 3 seconds, just to get control back. Velkrath laid out what they knew. An unidentified vessel of unknown origin had entered Concord space from outside the outer veil. It did not match any known ship design. Its energy output exceeded anything in the Concord's technical database. It had destroyed 1 scout cruiser and disabled 2 others without using a single weapon, simply by passing near them at speed. It was now moving deeper into Concord territory along a heading that, if continued, would take it toward the inner systems within a matter of days. A senator from the Vreth species, small beings, nervous and quick, known for their expertise in xenobiology, raised a question that was on everyone's mind. What species built it? Velkrath looked at the senator. We don't know. The room went quiet again. We have run the ship's energy profile and construction style against every species in the Concord database and every known pre-spaceflight civilization on record, Velkrath continued. There is no match. This vessel does not belong to any species we have ever encountered. Then it comes from outside the galaxy, said another senator. That is one possibility, said Velkrath. It is not one I find comforting. The debate that followed lasted 6 hours. Some senators wanted to send the full battle fleet immediately. Others urged caution, arguing that any species capable of building such a vessel would not be intimidated by a show of force. Others, a smaller, quieter group, said that the Concord should attempt communication before doing anything at all. In the end, the Senate voted to scramble the Outer Veil Defense Fleet as a precautionary measure. 4,000 warships began moving into formation along the boundary of the outer veil. Orders were also issued to deep space relay stations to broadcast all known conquered greeting protocols on every frequency toward the unknown vessel. No response came. 48 hours after Soval's first alert, the unknown ship crossed into conquered space at the outer veil boundary without stopping. It did not respond to any hails. It did not deviate from its course. It moved like something that had made a decision long ago and was simply following through on it. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. It came to a halt near a dead star system at the very edge of the outer veil, a region of space with no inhabited planets, no stations, no strategic value. It simply stopped there and went completely dark. Every sensor reading that had been blazing with its enormous energy output dropped to almost nothing. The ship was still there. Conquered sensors could still detect its mass, but it had stopped burning, stopped moving, stopped doing anything at all. It was waiting. For what no one in the conquered Senate could say. The chamber on Vel Prime buzzed with theories and fears and arguments that grew louder as the hours passed, and the ship continued to sit in silence, unmoving and unresponsive. In the operations center of Outer Veil Command, Subcommander Heth stood at a long table covered in sensor displays and tactical readouts. Officers moved around him constantly, delivering reports, updating maps, running analyses. He had not slept in 2 days. He stared at the single point on the galactic map that represented the unknown vessel, a small point of light in a vast field of stars. He had fought many battles in 30 years. He had faced many enemies. He had never felt, not once in all that time, the particular feeling that had settled into his chest over the last 2 days. He recognized it, though. He had heard old soldiers describe it. He had read about it in history texts that covered the Conquered's earliest and most dangerous conflicts. It was dread. Not fear of a known danger. Not the clean, manageable fear of a soldier who knows what he faces. It was the cold, creeping dread of something completely unknown. Something that moved through the void without fear or hurry. Something that had destroyed one of his ships without even trying. Something that had come from nowhere, announced nothing, and was now simply sitting in the dark at the edge of conquered space, waiting with a patience that felt almost deliberate. Almost like a message. I am here, I know you see me, and I am in no hurry. Heth picked up his communication unit and filed another report. He marked it absolute emergency, same as the first. Then he went back to staring at the map. The ship sat in the dark and waited. The Conquered did not sleep while the unknown ship waited. Every admiral in the Outer Veil Defense Fleet had been recalled from leave. Every warship within 3 sectors had been ordered to move toward the holding position near the dead star system, where the strange vessel sat in silence. Supply ships were loaded and dispatched. Fighter wings were put on full alert. Communication arrays across the outer veil were tuned to maximum sensitivity, pointed at that single motionless point in space, listening for anything. Nothing came back. In the Senate chamber on Vel Prime, the emergency sessions had stopped being sessions and had turned into something more like a permanent state of panic dressed up in formal robes. Senators argued through the night and into the next day. They argued about what the ship was. They argued about what to do. They argued about who should be in command of the response. They argued about whether the response should be military, diplomatic, or scientific. The one thing nobody argued about was whether the ship was dangerous. That much everyone agreed on. Supreme Commander Velkrath had taken personal command of the assembled fleet. 12,000 warships now formed a vast shell of metal and firepower around the dead star system. They came from 40 different member species of the Conquered, Dominion dreadnoughts sitting alongside Kreth patrol cruisers, Vreth science vessels tucked behind Gal battle platforms. It was the largest fleet assembly in living memory. The combined firepower of those 12,000 ships could have reduced a small planet to gravel. Velkrath ordered the fleet to hold position at a distance of 10,000 kilometers from the unknown vessel. From that distance, they could see it clearly now on visual sensors. The ship was big, not the biggest ship the Conquered had ever built. They had city-sized dreadnoughts in their most powerful fleets, but it was large, perhaps 3 kilometers from one end to the other. What made it remarkable was not its size, it was its appearance. The hull looked like a history book written in metal. The oldest sections of the ship were dark and heavily armored, built from a dull gray material that Conquered metallurgical scans couldn't quite identify. It was extremely dense, extremely hard, and showed signs of age that stretched back potentially hundreds of years. Over the top of this old frame, newer sections had been added, panels of brighter material, different textures, different construction styles layered one on top of the other like rings in a tree. The ship had been added to and rebuilt and repaired so many times that it looked almost organic, like something that had grown rather than been built. Deep scars ran along both sides. Some were old burn marks from weapons that had struck the hull at some point in the distant past. Others were patches of damage that had been repaired with what looked like deliberate care, as if whoever maintained this ship took pride in keeping it whole even when it had been hurt. There were places along the ship's flanks where you could see clearly that sections had been completely replaced, the new material still slightly brighter than the aged hull around it. The ship had been through battles, many of them, over a very long time. It was still there, still intact, still functional. That, more than anything, made Velkrath uneasy. He gave the order for the communication team to broadcast the Conquered's standard greeting protocol. This was a message developed over thousands of years for exactly this kind of situation, first contact with a civilization not previously known to the Conquered. It was transmitted in 200 languages simultaneously, covering every major language family in the known galaxy. It identified the Conquered, explained that the region was sovereign Conquered space, and requested that the unknown vessel identify itself and state its purpose. It was the 200th time this protocol had been used in Conquered history. On every previous occasion, the response had come within minutes. The communication team broadcast the message. They sent it on every frequency they had. They sent it as sound, as light pulses, as data streams in every encoding format they knew. They sent it once, then again, then again. 47 minutes passed in silence. Then the unknown ship responded. It came back on every single frequency simultaneously. Not just the communication frequencies, every frequency. The signal was so broad and so strong that it overloaded secondary receivers on ships 1,500 kilometers from the source. It came in 200 languages, perfectly replicated, with native-level fluency in every single one. The message was 4 words in each language. In Dominion Standard, the most widely spoken language in the Conquered, it said, "We are humanity. We have been looking for you for a very long time." The communication room went completely silent. Velkrath read the message twice. Then he said, slowly, "Run the species identifier. Cross-reference against all known civilizations in the Conquered database and in the pre-contact observation archive." The database search took 90 seconds. That was a long time for a system that could usually process a query in fractions of a second. It meant the database was working hard. The result came back as a single line of text. One possible match, confidence 12% C, HFYSci-Fi file, case 3301 alpha. Velkrath pulled up the file. It was old, 3,000 years old by the timestamp. It was a survey log from a Conquered exploration vessel that had been charting the outer regions of what was now the Dominion's inner territory. Standard procedure: fly through a region of space, note any inhabited or potentially inhabited worlds, file a report, move on. The survey vessel had detected a small planet in an unremarkable solar system, 1 yellow star, 8 planets, the third of which showed signs of primitive biological life. The report noted the presence of what the survey team classified as a pre-spaceflight biological civilization living on the third planet. They had noted the species in passing. They had logged the world's coordinates. They had rated the civilization as low development, no strategic value, no contact recommended at this time. They had not gone back. The world's name, as recorded in the survey log's own notes, using data picked up from the planet's primitive radio transmissions, was Earth. Velcrath stared at the word for a moment. Then he entered Earth's coordinates into the current galactic map. The map highlighted the location. It was not in the outer veil. It was not in some distant, unexplored corner of the galaxy. The coordinates put Earth squarely in the heart of what was now the Dominion's core territory, deep inside conquered space, surrounded on all sides by inhabited conquered worlds, conquered military installations, and conquered shipping lanes. Velcrath sat back in his command chair and stared at the screen. The implications were enormous, and they were bad. A species had been living inside conquered territory, not outside, not at the border, but inside, surrounded, for 3,000 years, and the conquered had simply forgotten about them. They had been noted in a survey, filed away, never followed up on, and eventually lost in an archive so deep that the database had only found it with a 12% confidence rating after 90 seconds of hard searching. 3,000 years ago, humanity had been early, pre-spaceflight, primitive by galactic standards. And now one of their ships was sitting 3 kilometers wide at the edge of conquered space, answering messages in 200 languages simultaneously, having apparently crossed the entire width of Dominion territory to get here. Velcrath thought about what that meant. He thought about how long that would take, and what kind of civilization would make that journey, and what that civilization might have learned during 3,000 years of living, surrounded by an empire that didn't know they existed. He thought about the 3 scout cruisers, about the one that hadn't survived. He thought about the ship's scarred hull and all the battles it had been through, and still it sat there, intact, waiting. He looked around his command bridge. His officers were looking at him. Every face in the room was waiting for his decision. He made the wrong one. It wasn't entirely his fault. He had been trained his entire life to respond to unknown threats with strength. The conquered had maintained its 6,000 years of peace by meeting every challenge with overwhelming force. Every uprising had been crushed. Every defiant species had been brought back into line. The conquered's power was built on the absolute certainty that no one could stand against it, and that certainty, carried for 6,000 years, had become a kind of reflex. The unknown ship had entered conquered space without permission. It had destroyed a conquered vessel. It had refused to communicate for days, and now it had replied to a greeting in a way that implied it had been watching and studying the conquered for long enough to learn 200 of its languages perfectly. That was not the behavior of a civilization that needed to be welcomed. In Velcrath's experience, in the conquered's long, proud experience, that was the behavior of something that needed to be stopped. He gave the order to fire. 12,000 warships opened up simultaneously. The combined fire was extraordinary. Energy beams, mass driver projectiles, torpedo spreads from hundreds of launch tubes, focused plasma lances from Dominion dreadnoughts. It all converged on the unknown vessel in a single massive salvo, a wall of destruction that lit up that region of space brighter than the dead star nearby. The impact was spectacular. The sensors lit up with readings. The tactical screens showed energy readings off the scale. Velcrath waited for the confirmation of destruction. It did not come. The sensor readings settled. The light faded. The tactical screens recalibrated. The ship was still there. Exactly where it had been, exactly the same, not drifting, not damaged, not listing to one side. Its hull showed no new damage. Its energy readings had barely changed. It sat in the void like a mountain sits on the ground, utterly unmoved by what had just been thrown at it. Not a single shield flicker, not a single visible impact mark from the most powerful simultaneous weapons discharge in conquered military history. The command bridge of Velcrath's flagship was absolutely silent for a very long 3 seconds. Then every communication channel opened at once. The voice that came through was calm. It was human-sounding, not harsh, not mechanical, not alien in the way that Velcrath had expected a truly foreign species to sound. It was a plain, even voice, speaking first in Dominion Standard and then, within the same breath, in the native language of every species whose ship was within range. It said, "That was a mistake. You fired first. We want that clearly understood. You fired first, and we did not return fire. We are recording everything. Every species in this fleet will be able to verify what happened here. You fired on a vessel that had done nothing except communicate with you." A pause. When the voice returned, it was still calm. That calm was, somehow, more frightening than anger would have been. "We are going to give you one chance to correct this mistake. We are not asking you to surrender. We are not asking you to retreat. We are asking you to stop, think about what you just did, and decide whether you want to continue down this road. Because we have been patient for a very long time. We have been waiting for this conversation for longer than your Senate has had living members. We did not come here to fight you." Another pause. "But we are very, very good at it, so think carefully before you fire again." The channel closed. Velcrath sat in his chair and said nothing. Around him, his officers were perfectly still. No one moved. No one spoke. The Outer Veil Defense Fleet, 12,000 of the most powerful warships in the galaxy, sat in formation around a single vessel that had absorbed their full fire without a scratch, and the universe felt, in that moment, just slightly different than it had before. Smaller somehow. It was not a feeling Velcrath was used to. It was not a feeling any conquered officer was used to. For 6,000 years, the universe had felt like something the conquered owned, like something they controlled, like something that would bend to their will because everything had always bent to their will. This ship was not bending. Velcrath looked at the sensor screen, at the single point of mass sitting perfectly still in the dead star system. Then he looked at the communications officer. "Get me the Senate," he said. His voice was steady. He had been a soldier for too long to let it shake. But his hands, underneath the arms of his command chair where nobody could see them, were pressed flat against his legs, because if he didn't press them flat, they would shake too. The Senate session that followed was the longest in conquered history. It went on for 14 hours without a break. By the end of it, the chamber smelled of stress and cold food, and the biological byproducts of 400 species sitting too close together for too long. Tempers had broken and been rebuilt and broken again. There had been 2 separate incidents where senators from different species had to be physically separated by the chamber guards. But in the end, a decision was made. The conquered would treat the situation as an act of war. The unknown vessel, which the military had begun referring to simply as Target 1 in their reports, because nobody liked to say, "the ship we couldn't damage," out loud, would be engaged with the full force available until it was destroyed or forced to surrender. At the same time, a secondary fleet would be dispatched to the coordinates of the planet called Earth to assess whatever civilization existed there and determine the extent of the threat. The session was archived and sealed under the highest classification. What happened next, the conquered would later spend a great deal of time trying to explain away as something other than what it was. They would use words like tactical maneuver and strategic engagement in their official reports. They would describe it as a complex and sophisticated military operation. The truth was simpler. The truth was that the conquered attacked something it didn't understand and couldn't hurt. And what followed was 9 days of the most complete and humbling military defeat any power in the galaxy had ever suffered. It began on the morning of the second day, after the fleet had first opened fire. Target 1, which the crew of the vessel had by then identified by name during several more broadcasts. The ship was called UNSV Prometheus, the letters standing for United Nations Space Vessel, names that meant nothing to conquered intelligence at the time, began to move. It moved slowly at first, not with the terrifying speed it had shown coming in through the outer veil. It drifted out of the dead star system and into the outer edge of the assembled fleet. Velcrath ordered another full-firing salvo. The 12,000 ships discharged again. The Prometheus absorbed it like it absorbed everything else. Then it moved between the ships. This was what made the commanders in the fleet begin to feel something beyond simple fear. The Prometheus did not rush. It did not burn through the fleet at the terrible speed it had shown entering conquered space. It moved at a relatively moderate pace, fast but not impossibly so. What it did as it moved was precise, deliberate, and deeply unsettling. It targeted systems, not ships. As the Prometheus moved through the assembled fleet, it fired. Not the massive energy weapons that conquered warships used, which were designed to punch through hull plating and destroy engines and kill crew. The weapons the Prometheus used were different. They were focused, narrow, precisely aimed at specific parts of specific ships. A beam would reach out and strike an engine array, not the whole engine, just the primary coupling. Another would hit a weapon system's power feed. Another would trace across the sensor array of a dreadnought with surgical accuracy, leaving the hull completely intact but rendering the ship blind. Ship after ship in the fleet found itself suddenly unable to move, or unable to fire, or unable to see but not destroyed. The crew was untouched. Life support was untouched. The ships were still there, still full of living soldiers. They just couldn't do anything anymore. Word spread through the fleet quickly. The Prometheus wasn't killing anyone. It was disabling ships. The realization produced two very different reactions depending on where in the fleet you were receiving the information. Among the Dominion officers and the other interspecies commanders, the ones who held the most power within the conquered, the reaction was fury. Disabling ships instead of destroying them felt like mockery. It felt like being looked at with contempt. It felt like being shown, very clearly, that your enemy could kill you if they wanted to and has simply chosen not to. Among the smaller species, the Vreth, the Keth, the Sarath, the dozen or so civilizations who had been conquered members for centuries but had always sat at the lower end of the Senate's power structure, the reaction was different. They watched a vessel absorb the full fire of 12,000 warships without a scratch, and then respond by disabling enemy ships with the care of a surgeon rather than the destruction of a killer. They started thinking. On the third day, the Prometheus broadcast another message. This one was not directed at Velcrath or the Senate. It was broadcast on every frequency, to every ship in the fleet, and it carried clearly to conquered relay stations deep inside the Empire's borders. Millions of beings on dozens of worlds received the broadcast simultaneously. It was not a threatening message. It was a statement of facts. The Prometheus crew listed, one by one, what they had done since the engagement began. They named each ship they had disabled. They described exactly what systems they had targeted and what they had left intact. They stated, clearly and repeatedly, that no conquered personnel had been killed since the initial engagement. The deaths of the scout cruiser crew were acknowledged and described as an accident caused by the Prometheus, not anticipating the ships being so close to its path at high speed. Then they released the archive file. The 3,000-year-old survey log from conquered exploration vessel Case 3301 Alpha. The one that had documented the planet Earth, rated it low development, no strategic value, and never gone back. Every being in the fleet heard it. Every sensor operator and navigator and gun crew member and junior officer heard the survey team's own voices describing a small blue world and its early civilization, and marking it as unimportant and moving on. And then they heard the Prometheus crew speaking calmly and without anger, explain what had happened to that small blue world in the 3,000 years since it had been forgotten. The smaller species in the fleet began talking to each other. On the fourth day, something happened that Velcrath had not prepared for, had not predicted, and would later describe as the moment he understood that the situation was no longer recoverable. New ships appeared and conquered space. They did not come through any sensor-monitored region. They did not emerge from hyperspace at the known jump points or fold entry corridors that conquered navigation charted and watched. They appeared from unexpected places, behind the dark side of moons, from inside dense asteroid fields, from regions of space that conquered sensors had read as empty. The first ship to appear was detected by a routine patrol vessel near the Geth Nebula, deep inside conquered space. The patrol vessel challenged the new contact. The response came in the same calm, clear manner as the Prometheus. The ship identified itself as the UNSV Endurance. It was not hostile. It was simply there, sitting in conquered space with its transponder broadcasting openly. Within 6 hours, 40 more ships had appeared, not clustered together but spread across a vast section of conquered space. Each of them had emerged from a hiding spot. Each of them broadcast the same open identification signal. None of them fired on anything. By the end of the 5th day, the number was over 300. The conquered intelligence service went into a controlled panic. Internal reports, which were classified immediately but would later be recovered and read by a great many people, described a sophisticated infiltration operation that could only have taken years to put in place. Ships of human design had been hiding in conquered space, not just at the edges, but throughout it, across multiple sectors, occupying positions that any military analyst could see had been chosen for strategic coverage rather than convenience. Humanity had not stumbled into conquered space. They had mapped it from the inside. Velcrath received the intelligence reports one by one as the days passed, and his fleet continued its failing engagement with the Prometheus. He read each one. He made notes. He filed responses requesting more information that increasingly never came, because the intelligence service was too busy trying to track all the new ships appearing throughout the Empire. On the 6th day, 3 of the smaller conquered species sent messages, not to Velcrath, not to the Senate. They sent them to the Prometheus directly. The Vreth message was the most direct. It said, "We are not your enemy. We have not fired on your vessel. We request that this be noted." The Keth message was similar. The Sareth message was longer and included a formal statement of grievances against the Dominion that had, apparently, been building for several hundred years and was now being presented to an outside party for the first time. By the 7th day, 6 more species had sent similar messages. 3 of them quietly began pulling their ships out of fleet formation and moving them to holding positions at the edge of the engagement zone. Velcrath sent orders demanding they return to formation. 2 species complied. 4 did not. The Conquered's unified front was cracking. On the 8th day, the Prometheus changed what it was doing. It stopped moving through the fleet. It gathered speed slowly, deliberately, building up velocity in a way that Conquered sensors could track clearly and predict. Every tracking station in the fleet had its course laid in before it got there. The destination was obvious. The Prometheus was heading for Vel Prime, the capital world. Velcrath dispatched the fastest ships in the fleet to intercept it before it could reach the inner systems. He had no reason to believe they would stop it. Nothing so far had stopped it. But he couldn't simply let it fly through conquered territory toward the Senate chamber without making the attempt. The intercept fleet moved into position. The Prometheus flew through them. It did not fire once. It disabled the engines of every ship that moved directly into its path, with the same precise, non-lethal targeting it had demonstrated from the beginning, and it simply continued on its heading. It entered orbit above Vel Prime at dawn on the 9th day. It was visible from the surface, a dark shape against the pale blue of the planet's sky, moving slowly across the horizon, catching the light of the sun in a way that made it look almost beautiful from the ground. People in the capital city stopped in the streets and looked up. Children pointed. News broadcasts that had been covering the fleet engagement with breathless commentary suddenly fell quiet as their cameras turned to the sky. The Prometheus did not fire a single shot. It did not threaten. It did not make demands. It simply orbited. Slowly, visibly, undeniably present. The Senate chamber, which sat under that sky, held an emergency vote within 3 hours of the Prometheus taking up its orbit. The vote was on a single question: should the conquered request a ceasefire? The vote was not close. Grand Admiral Velkrath received the Senate's authorization shortly after midday. He sat with it in his hands for a moment, a physical document, printed in the old formal style that the Senate used for decisions of historic weight. His name was on it. His seal was on it. He would be the one to send the message. He thought about his 30 years of service. He thought about the 6,000 years of conquered history. He thought about the fleet behind him, hundreds of disabled ships drifting in the outer system, and the clean, undamaged hull of the Prometheus moving calmly overhead. He thought about the survey log, the forgotten world, the small blue planet rated no strategic value 3,000 years ago. He picked up the communication device and opened a channel to the Prometheus. "This is Grand Admiral Velkrath of the conquered Outer Veil Defense Fleet," he said. "I am transmitting a formal request for ceasefire, effective immediately on behalf of the Galactic Senate of the Conquered." He set down the document. The response from the Prometheus came in under 4 minutes. "Ceasefire accepted. All United Nations vessels will stand down immediately. We are ready to talk whenever you are." Velkrath looked at the clock. 4 minutes. Less, actually. He had the exact timestamp on his screen. 3 minutes and 47 seconds from the moment he sent the ceasefire request to the moment the Prometheus confirmed. He had been in enough negotiations in his career to know what a fast response time meant. It meant the other party had been ready. It meant the answer had been prepared in advance, waiting only for the question. He thought about all the human ships hidden throughout conquered space. He thought about the Prometheus absorbing 12,000 warships firing simultaneously. He thought about 3,000 years of silence. 3 minutes and 47 seconds, because they had known he was going to ask. They had planned for this moment too. He looked up at the sky, at the dark shape of the Prometheus moving through the high orbit, unhurried, patient, enormous and scarred and completely intact. 9 days. The engagement had lasted 9 days. The conquered called it a war. Humanity, Velkrath suspected, called it something else. They had expected a warship on the inside. Every member of the conquered delegation that boarded the Prometheus had formed a picture in their minds of what it would look like inside. The picture was roughly the same for all of them, shaped by their own military experience and by the way the ship had conducted itself during the 9-day engagement. They expected weapon racks on the walls. They expected dim lighting and bare metal corridors. They expected trophies, maybe markings of past victories, the kind of things that warrior cultures always displayed to impress visitors and remind guests of what they were dealing with. They expected to feel small when they stepped through the airlock. The Prometheus was not what they expected. The delegation had been transported to the ship in a standard Conquered shuttle. There were 8 of them: Grand Admiral Velkrath, 3 senior senators representing the Dominion and 2 allied species, 2 intelligence officers, and a xenobiologist from the Vreth who had specifically requested to be included, and had spent the shuttle ride pressed against the porthole, watching the approaching ship with enormous golden eyes that could not seem to look anywhere else. The docking procedure was smooth. Whatever the Prometheus's systems were, They were fully compatible with Concord shuttle technology, which told the intelligence officers something important that they quietly noted in their records. The airlock opened from the inside before the delegation had finished their docking checks. The corridor beyond was wide and well lit. The light was warm, not the cold blue-white of Concord military vessels, but a softer color, closer to the light of a star. The walls were clean. The floor was some kind of dark material that gave slightly underfoot, absorbing sound. There was artwork on the walls. That was the first thing that stopped the delegation in its tracks. Artwork, paintings and photographs in frames, mounted at regular intervals along the corridor walls. Some of them were landscapes, a blue ocean under a yellow-white sun, mountains with white peaks against a pale sky. Some were abstract. Colors laid across a surface in patterns that seemed to mean something without being clearly readable. Some were portraits of people, human beings, the delegation realized, the species whose ship they were standing inside. Varied faces, varied ages, varied expressions. One of the Dominion senators looked at the paintings and said nothing. He had been a soldier for 50 years. He had boarded many enemy ships after battles. None of them had ever had paintings in the corridors. They were met by a young man who introduced himself simply as the ship's liaison officer. He was shorter than every member of the delegation. Humans, it turned out, were not particularly tall by Galactic standards. He had dark skin and a calm, professional manner and spoke Dominion standard with perfect fluency and only the faintest accent. He welcomed them aboard the Prometheus without ceremony and led them through the ship. The walk to the conference room took several minutes. They passed through more corridors, through a large open area where crew members sat at workstations monitoring systems, through a section that smelled of food being prepared somewhere nearby. The humans they passed looked at the delegation with curiosity, not hostility. Some of them nodded. A few stopped what they were doing to watch the alien visitors pass. Nobody reached for a weapon. Nobody spoke in hushed, urgent tones as the delegation went by. The ship felt lived in. That was the word the xenobiologist from the Vreth used later when writing his report. It felt like a place where people had spent real time, not just a machine built for combat. There were mugs on workstations and personal objects on shelves and small plants growing in containers fixed to the walls near the lighting fixtures. The plants had small flowers on them. The flowers were yellow. The conference room was the last thing any of them had expected. It was a warm, circular space with a large round table at its center. The chairs around the table had been adjusted. Each one was shaped differently, built to accommodate a different body type, a different physiology. Velkrath looked at his chair. It was built for a Dominion frame, large and wide, with armrests at the right height for four-armed beings. The senator from the Vreth species saw a seat narrower and lower to the ground, fitted with the kind of back support that Vreth spines needed in long-seated positions. Every member of the delegation found a chair that fit them as if it had been built specifically with them in mind. Because it had been. At the center of the table were food and drink, a wide variety of items, presented in small containers and dishes and cups arranged so that each delegate had options from their own world's cuisine or close approximations of it. Velkrath looked at the cup in front of him. He reached out and lifted it. He smelled it. It was Teth broth, a Dominion drink, traditional, warm, made from a plant that grew only in the northern plains of the Dominion homeworld. It was the kind of drink you gave someone when they arrived home after a long time away, or when they needed comfort, or when you wanted to say without words that you knew who they were and you had prepared for them specifically. He set it down without drinking it. The intelligence officers were looking at the food in front of them the way they looked at unexploded ordnance, carefully, without touching. Then the door at the far side of the room opened, and the human delegation entered. There were 5 of them, 3 men and 2 women, all dressed in simple dark clothing with a small badge on the chest, a circle with a design inside it that the xenobiologist later identified as a stylized image of the planet Earth. They ranged in age from perhaps 35 to a woman who was clearly the oldest person in the room and who moved with the careful steadiness of someone in their late 70s. That woman sat down at the head of the table, directly across from Velcrath. She looked at him for a moment and then she smiled. It was a real smile, not a diplomatic performance. Her eyes were dark and clear, and they held the kind of steady attention that Velcrath associated with people who had seen a great many difficult things and come through them without breaking. Her name, the liaison officer announced, was Ambassador Yara Chen. She was the political officer of the Prometheus, a role she had held since the ship launched. She was the lead negotiator for humanity. She said in Dominion Standard, "Thank you for coming. Please, have something to eat. We've been traveling a long time and we like to share food when we meet people." One of the Dominion senators said stiffly, "We are here to discuss terms." "Yes," said Yara Chen, "we will, but first I'd like to know how everyone is doing. Velcrath is the teth broth to your liking. I was told it should be served warm but not hot." Velcrath looked at the cup. He looked at the old woman across the table. He picked up the cup and drank. It tasted exactly right. Something about that was more unsettling than anything the Prometheus had done in 9 days of combat. The terms that humanity presented were not terms of conquest. This was the second surprise of the day, and for some members of the delegation it was the bigger one. They had come prepared for demands, reparations, territory, resource agreements, the kinds of things that victorious powers in galactic history had always extracted from the defeated. They had lists prepared of what they were willing to concede and what they would hold firm on. Velcrath had 3 separate negotiating strategies outlined in the secure portfolio at his side. He never opened it. Yara Chen placed a single document on the table. It was a physical document, thin, flat, clearly printed, not a data file. It was 10 pages long. She slid it to the center of the table and said, "These are our terms. Read them, please, all of them. Take as much time as you need." The delegation read. The terms were 4 in number. The first required a formal Concord acknowledgement that the planet Earth had been surveyed, cataloged, and never followed up on, a violation of the Concord's own founding charter, which required that any cataloged inhabited world receive a follow-up contact assessment within 100 years of first documentation. The second required the immediate and complete withdrawal of all Dominion military and administrative assets from the Sol system, the solar system containing Earth, and the establishment of Earth's sovereign territory as a protected zone under standard Concord law. The third was the one that had every member of the Dominion delegation sitting up straighter by the time they reached it. It required that humanity be granted membership in the Galactic Concord, not as a new applicant species, but as a retroactive founding signatory. The legal argument was laid out in a footnote that the intelligence officers spent several minutes reading in silence. The founding charter of the Concord, written 6,000 years ago, established that any surveyed and documented civilization could be considered a member from the date of their first documentation. Earth had been documented 3,000 years ago. Humanity had, technically, by the Concord's own founding law, been a member of the Concord for 3,000 years. They were not asking for membership, they were collecting it. The fourth term required full access to all Concord records related to Earth. Every survey, every observation file, every piece of data the Concord had ever gathered about humanity's world. All of it, released completely and without redaction. That was it, 4 terms. No demand for territory. No reparations for the attack, no demand for military concessions or fleet reductions, no requirement that the Concord acknowledge defeat. High Consul Draven, the lead Dominion senator in the delegation, read the document twice, looked up at Yara Chen and asked, "Is this all?" "That's all," she said. No reparations. No. No military terms. None. Draven studied her for a moment. His 4 large hands were folded on the table in a deliberate show of control. You absorbed the combined fire of 12,000 warships and suffered no damage. Your ships are currently positioned throughout conquered territory and locations that would give you significant strategic advantage in any continued engagement. You have demonstrated that we cannot hurt you, and your terms are these 4 items. Yes, said Yara Chen. Why? Draven asked. She looked at him steadily. Because we didn't come here to break things. We came here because of what was always ours. She pushed the document slightly closer to him. We want what the charter says we're entitled to. We want our record cleared. We want our solar system. We want the seat at the table that should have been offered to us 3,000 years ago. That's it. Draven looked at the document for a long moment. Then he asked the question that every being in the room had been thinking since the moment they boarded the ship. He asked it quietly, without aggression, in the tone of a man who simply needed to know. How many ships do you have? The room was very still. Yara Chen looked at him. Then she picked up the small cup of tea that had been placed in front of her. One of the human delegation members had brought a small brewing device and made it during the reading period, filling the room with a faint, pleasant smell, and she took a slow sip. She set the cup down. She did not answer the question. She looked instead at the full delegation and said, I'd like to suggest we take a short break before beginning the formal session. There are restrooms down the corridor on the left, fitted for your various requirements. We also have a small meal prepared if anyone is hungry. She stood up, smoothing her dark jacket. The document stands as written, she said. We're ready to formalize whenever the Senate is ready to respond. She walked to the side of the room and began quietly speaking with one of her own delegation members about something unrelated, completely relaxed, as if the conversation that had just taken place had been a routine and unremarkable part of her day. Velkrath sat in his chair and looked at the document on the table. He thought about the question Draven had asked and the answer that had not been given. He thought about all the human ships positioned throughout conquered space, the ones they knew about and the ones they certainly didn't. He thought about 3,000 years of preparation and a 9-day engagement that humanity had clearly already planned the ending of before it began. He picked up his cup of teth broth and finished it. It was still warm. They had timed it perfectly. Of course they had. The Conquered signed. It took 3 more days of formal session aboard the Prometheus before all 4 terms were agreed to and the final document was prepared. The signing ceremony was brief and almost quiet compared to what had come before it. Grand Admiral Velkrath added his seal. High Consul Draven added the Senate's formal mark. 2 representatives from smaller conquered species, who had been invited as independent witnesses, the Vreth and the Keth, who had been among the first to privately reach out to the human fleet during the engagement, signed as observers. Yara Chen signed for humanity with a plain writing instrument that she carried in her jacket pocket. She didn't make a speech. She didn't mark the moment with ceremony. She looked at the completed document for a moment, nodded once to herself and said, Good, thank you all. Then she asked if anyone wanted more tea. The formal report that the conquered Senate released to its member species the following week described the agreement in careful, measured language. It acknowledged the rediscovery of a previously documented species. It outlined the terms of Earth's formal membership. It described the previous 9-day engagement in the flattest and most neutral language the Senate's communications team could produce. It said as little as possible about what had actually happened. The actual story, however, spread on its own. Crew members from the ships that had been disabled during the engagement told their families what they had seen. Officers who had watched 12,000 warships fail to leave a mark on a single vessel described it in letters home that got passed around and read by people who passed them on further. The Vreth and Keth delegations, no longer bound to Dominion information protocols, spoke openly with their own people. And then there was the broadcast that the Prometheus itself had released during the engagement, the one carrying the 3,000-year-old survey log, the one that had gone out on every frequency to every ship and station in range. That broadcast hadn't been contained. It had spread through relay stations deeper and deeper into conquered space, and millions of beings had heard it, and millions more had heard about it secondhand. And by the time the Senate's careful official report was released, most of the galaxy already knew the bones of the story. A species had been forgotten. They had grown anyway. They had come back. The details filled in slowly over the following months, as humanity began releasing its own account of events. They did this through the Concord's own communication network, to which they now had full member access, in a series of broadcasts and documents that were dry and factual, and completely without self-congratulation, which somehow made them more compelling to read than any boastful account would have been. The survey vessel Case 3301 Alpha had passed through the Sol system 3,012 years ago. Its log, recovered and released in full under the terms of the agreement, showed that the survey team had spent approximately 4 hours scanning Earth and its neighboring planets before concluding their assessment and moving on. They had noted signs of a developing civilization. They had marked the world as non-threatening. They had filed their report. The file had gone into the archive, and nobody had ever looked at it again. In the 3,012 years that followed, a great deal had happened on Earth. Humanity had fought wars, many of them, some so destructive that they came close to ending the species entirely. They had poisoned portions of their own planet badly enough to shift the climate. They had survived plagues. They had faced the kind of internal conflicts that split civilizations at their roots, dividing peoples against each other along lines of culture and belief and resource. They had, multiple times across multiple centuries, come very close to the edge of their own extinction. And they had always come back. They had pulled themselves from the edge of each crisis not through luck, but through what one human historian, writing for the document release, described as the characteristic stubbornness of a species that has never once, in its entire evolutionary history, been willing to accept that something is impossible. They had reached space on their own, without guidance, without help, without any of the technological sharing that conquered member species gave to each other. They had built their first generation of spacecraft from scratch, through trial and error and disaster and learning and trying again. Their first missions beyond their own world had been slow and fragile and dangerous. Dozens of early astronauts, as they called their space travelers, had died in the process. They had kept going anyway. Then, roughly 800 years before the Prometheus arrived at the outer veil, a deep space survey team had found something unexpected near the edge of humanity's solar system. Caught in the gravitational wake of a wandering dwarf planet was a piece of ancient technology, not human technology, but alien. Very old. A deep space relay station, automated, long since depleted of power, but with its data storage intact. The station was Concord technology, from the same era as the survey vessel Case 3301 Alpha. The data recovered from the station took decades to decrypt. Human linguists and historians worked on it for generations, but eventually they cracked it, language by language. And what they found inside was not just one survey log. It was a partial map of the galaxy, records of hundreds of civilizations, notes from thousands of years of conquered exploration. A window into a galaxy that was enormously, almost incomprehensibly populated, and that had looked at humanity and decided they weren't worth stopping for. The decision that followed was not made in a single meeting. It was not the decision of one leader or one generation. It was a conversation that humanity had with itself over several hundred years. They knew they were not alone. They knew that out there, in a galaxy full of civilizations, An empire of 400 species had the ability to appear above their world without warning and do anything it wished. They knew that they had been seen and dismissed, which meant they could be seen again, at any time by anyone, and the next visitor might not be as indifferent as the survey team. They had two choices. The first was to announce themselves, broadcast a signal, invite contact, step into the galactic community openly and see what happened. This option was debated extensively. It was ultimately set aside, not out of fear exactly, but out of a specific and carefully reasoned concern. Humanity had read the Concord's records. They had studied the history of the empire that surrounded their solar system without knowing it. They had seen the pattern. Species that were discovered before they were strong enough to negotiate from any position of strength were absorbed, diminished, or made into dependent members of a structure not built with them in mind. They had no interest in being absorbed. The second choice was to prepare, to grow quietly, to develop without drawing attention, to use the knowledge from the relay station to learn everything they possibly could about the galaxy around them before taking a single step into it, to be patient, and to be ready before they were visible. They chose patience. The ships had come first, a fleet built over generations, each vessel designed with technology that pulled from everything humanity had learned both from its own research and from the slow, careful analysis of Concord technical records recovered from the relay station. Human engineers pushed hard. They had no trade partners, no species to buy technology from, no shortcut available to them. What they built from their own knowledge, and because of that it was genuinely theirs, not a copy, not an approximation, but the result of human minds approaching problems that the Concorde had solved one way and finding, in many cases, completely different ways to solve them. Better ways in some cases. The shields that had absorbed 12,000 warships firing simultaneously were one example. The propulsion system that had let the Prometheus cross Concorde space in the time it did was another. These were not stolen technologies. They were human technologies, grown from human science, shaped by human necessity. The necessity of a species that had no backup option and therefore could not afford to accept good enough when better was achievable. Then came the intelligence operation. The ships that had hidden throughout Concorde space had been placed over a period of nearly 30 years, moving quietly and carefully, using a technique that exploited a gap in Concorde sensor technology that human engineers had identified from the recovered records. The ships had run cold and silent, using minimal power, staying in positions chosen specifically because Concorde patrol routes avoided them. They had not all gone in at once. That would have been detectable. They had gone in ones and twos across decades, slipping into position and going still and waiting. By the time the Prometheus crossed the outer veil, humanity had been inside Concorde space for 3 decades. The 9-day engagement, the Prometheus crew explained in their release documents, had been planned for. Not hoped for, planned for. The response to the ceasefire request had been 4 minutes because the text was already written and had been waiting to be sent. The conference room aboard the Prometheus, with its custom chairs and the teth broth and the carefully prepared food from every delegation member's homeworld, had been set up weeks before the ship crossed into Concorde space, because the people who planned the mission had calculated that a ceasefire and negotiation was the most probable outcome if the initial engagement was handled correctly. Correctly meant, don't kill anyone, don't destroy anything that can't be replaced, be impossible to beat, but don't punish them for trying. Let the smaller species see what you're doing. Let the empire's own internal tensions do some of the work. Make it clear that you could end the conversation any time you chose to, but that what you actually want is a conversation. It worked exactly as planned. The document releases and the slow spread of the story through the Concorde's populations had effects that the Senate had not anticipated and could not contain. Among the Dominion and the other inner species, the powerful ones who had run the Concorde for millennia, The reaction was predominantly one of deeply uncomfortable reassessment. They had fired first. Their own records confirmed it. The Prometheus's records confirmed it. Every sensor log from every ship in the fleet confirmed it. The most powerful military force in the galaxy had opened fire on a vessel that had done nothing except communicate. And the vessel had absorbed the attack without harm and responded not with destruction, but with precision, restraint, and documentation. They could not make the story go away. They could not frame it as a victory. They could not file it away in a deep archive the way they had filed away the survey log of a small blue world 3,000 years ago. Among the smaller conquered species, the ones who had always sat at the lower end of the Senate's power, who had always benefited from the conquered's protection but had never quite been equal partners in it, the reaction was something else entirely. It was quiet and it was strong, and it showed up in Senate voting patterns over the following years in ways that the Dominion found increasingly frustrating. Humanity had done something that no species inside the conquered had ever been able to do. They had demonstrated in front of the entire galaxy that the Dominion was not invincible, not because they had defeated it in the traditional sense, no worlds burned, no fleets annihilated, no surrender demanded, but because they had stood in front of the most powerful military in the galaxy and it had broken itself against them. And in the aftermath, the stories and the records and the honest accounting of what had happened were out in the open where everyone could see them. That changed things, quietly, slowly, in ways that would take years to fully measure, but it changed them. 6 months after the signing, Ambassador Yara Chen traveled to Vel Prime. She was given quarters in the Senate district, modest rooms that she reportedly expressed satisfaction with. She attended a series of formal introductory sessions with Senate officials from various species, was briefed on conquered procedures, and was shown to her assigned workspace in the Senate building. On the morning of her first formal session as a seated member, she arrived early. She sat in humanity's designated seat, a new seat, added to the chamber's outermost ring, and she looked around the room. The chamber was filling slowly. Senators arrived in small groups, found their seats, spoke to colleagues. Many of them looked at her. Some looked with hostility, some with curiosity, some, particularly from the smaller species, with expressions she recognized as something approaching the way you look at someone who did something you had long wished someone would do. The session chair called the chamber to order. The formal greeting to a new member, as prescribed by Concord Charter, was read aloud, a long and ceremonial text that had been recited 400 times in the Concord's history, each time a new species took their seat. It acknowledged the new member. It welcomed them to the community of the galaxy. It stated the rights and responsibilities of membership. When it was finished, the session chair performed the traditional courtesy. She looked at the newest member of the Concord Senate and asked if they had anything to say before the day's proceedings began. The chamber was quiet. Yara Chen stood up. She was the shortest being in the room. She was the oldest delegate on the floor. She stood straight and she looked around the chamber, all 400 species, all the power and history and weight of 6,000 years of galactic civilization, and her expression was completely calm. She said, "We've waited 3,000 years for this meeting." She looked at the session chair. She looked at the Dominion senators. She looked at the Vreth delegate, who was watching her with large golden eyes that were, if one looked carefully, slightly wet. "Let's not waste it." The chamber erupted. Not in the way that meant anger or disorder. In the way that means something has broken open that had been waiting a long time to break. Species who had never agreed on anything were on their feet. The sound was enormous and complex and different in every part of the room, because beings express things differently, some through sound, some through movement, some through the changing of skin color or the extension of display structures or the rapid percussion of hard surfaces. It went on for a full minute before the session chair could call order again. Yara Chen sat back down. She straightened the document in front of her, the day's agenda, printed in the standard format she had been handed at the door, and she clicked her writing instrument once. Back aboard the Prometheus, still in orbit above Vel Prime, the crew had been watching the session on a live feed in the common room. When the chamber erupted, a cheer went up that moved from room to room down the length of the ship. Crew members embraced each other. Someone started music. Someone else started crying and then laughed at themselves for it. The ship's cook, who had been awake since before dawn preparing a meal for the occasion, came out of the kitchen and stood in the corridor with flour on her hands and watched the screen and didn't say anything for a long time. Somewhere in the galaxy, in a solar system with one yellow star and 8 planets, on a world with blue oceans and green land and white clouds, and a long and complicated history, it was morning in several of the major cities. People were waking up and starting their days and living their lives in the way that people do when they don't yet know that something historic has just happened far away. They would learn soon. The Concord's communication network was fast, and humanity now had full access to it. By that evening, every screen on Earth would carry the image of a small, gray-haired woman, standing up in a golden chamber full of the galaxy's most powerful beings. By that evening, the galaxy would know that the species it had once surveyed, deemed unimportant, and forgotten had not forgotten them, had never forgotten them, had simply been patient. 3,000 years of quiet, deliberate, unbroken patience, the patience of a species that had survived everything its own world and its own nature could throw at it, and had come out on the other side of all of it not harder or colder or more warlike, but more certain, more steady, more themselves. They had not conquered the galaxy. They had not humiliated it or broken it or burned it down to show that they could. They had joined it, on their own terms, after doing their homework, and they had walked through the door that their own founding charter had left open for them 3,000 years ago and simply sat down at the table that had always been theirs. Later, in one of the many profiles written about Yara Chen in the years that followed, a journalist asked her what she had been thinking at the moment she stood up to address the Senate. She thought about it for a moment, then she smiled. "I was thinking that I needed to adjust the microphone," she said. "The chair was a little low." Then she picked up her tea and changed the subject.